Some crimes stain the history of a nation so deeply that decades later, they are still remembered with a shiver. The Truro murders are one of those cases. They are not only among Australia's most disturbing crimes, but they also left behind scars that remind us of how fragile safety can be. What happened in the late 1970s on the outskirts of Adelaide shocked the entire country. 7 young women vanished. 6 of them were later found buried in shallow graves near the small town of Truro. And their deaths exposed a partnership of killers whose cruelty left investigators and the public horrified. The story begins in 1976 and 1977, when several young women disappeared from the streets of Adelaide. At first, their vanishings were treated as isolated cases. Some were thought to have run away. Others were dismissed as troubled youth. But as the number of missing girls grew, whispers began to circulate that something darker was happening. Still, no one could have imagined just how grim the truth was. It would take 2 years before the hidden horror began to unravel. In April 1978, 2 men were driving near Truro, a small town outside Adelaide, when they stumbled upon human bones. At first they thought it was an animal, but soon realized it was something far worse. Police were called, and the skeletal remains were confirmed to be human. That discovery marked the beginning of a grim investigation that would eventually uncover multiple burial sites scattered across the South Australian countryside. The victims were young women, aged between their mid-teens and early 20s. They had been hitchhiking, a common practice at the time, especially in Adelaide, where public transport was limited and hitching a ride was seen as normal. These women were vulnerable, and they crossed paths with predators who were hunting for exactly that, someone young alone and trusting enough to step into a stranger's car. The killers responsible were Christopher Worrell and James Miller. Their names would forever be tied to one of the darkest chapters in Australian crime. Worrell was described as charming, manipulative, and magnetic. Women were drawn to him, but behind his charm was a dangerous personality, cold, calculating, and violent. Miller, on the other hand, was quiet and submissive. He had a dependent personality and was said to be easily influenced. The 2 men formed a deadly partnership, with Worrell luring the women and Miller acting as his accomplice in disposing of the victims. Investigators later pieced together a chilling pattern. Worrell would convince young women to get into the car, often with promises of a lift. Once inside, he would drive them to isolated areas. There, the violence began. The women were assaulted, strangled, and then buried in shallow graves with little effort to conceal them. Miller admitted during questioning that he never directly killed the victims but helped bury them afterwards. In his mind, that somehow made him less guilty. But for investigators, the difference was meaningless. Both men played a role in ending innocent lives. The murders might have continued for years if not for a cruel twist of fate. In 1977, Christopher Worrell died in a car accident. James Miller survived the crash. For months after Worrell's death, Miller lived with the weight of what they had done. Eventually, his guilt, or perhaps his need to share the secret, led him to confess. That confession broke the case wide open and exposed the full scale of the crimes. Miller led police to the burial sites, one after another, pointing out where the bodies were hidden. The search teams unearthed 6 victims near Truro and surrounding areas. Each discovery was more heartbreaking than the last. Families who had clung to hope for years finally had answers, but the answers were worse than their nightmares. They had not lost their daughters to chance or misfortune. They had lost them to the cruelty of men who treated their lives as disposable. The trial that followed captured the attention of the entire country. With Worrell already dead, James Miller stood alone to face justice. He admitted to helping bury the bodies, but tried to distance himself from the actual killings. He painted Worrell as the mastermind, the charismatic predator who controlled him. Prosecutors, however, argued that Miller was complicit every step of the way. He knew what was happening. He did nothing to stop it. And by helping cover the crimes, he allowed the killings to continue. The jury agreed. Miller was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to life in prison. He remained behind bars until his death in 2008, never released. never forgiven by a public that saw him as one half of a monstrous duo. But even after the trial, questions remain. The remains of a seventh young woman had been found in the area, but her connection to Worrell and Miller was never fully proven. Some investigators believed she too was one of their victims. Others argued the evidence was not strong enough to make the link. To this day, that question hangs over the case, a reminder that not all mysteries find neat resolutions. What makes the Truro murders especially chilling is the way they destroyed the sense of safety in Adelaide at the time. Hitchhiking had been considered normal. After the case, that culture of trust was shattered. Parents warned their children never to accept rides from strangers. The streets felt less safe. The idea that two men could cruise around the city, pick up young women, and vanish them without anyone noticing was a wake-up call for the entire nation. The families of the victims never fully recovered. For them, the pain was not just about loss, but about the way their daughters' lives ended. They had to live with the knowledge of the violence inflicted on their children, and with the frustration that for years, no one connected the disappearances. Their grief was compounded by the long silence, the months and years when they did not know the truth. Even when the remains were found, closure felt impossible, because closure cannot exist in the shadow of such brutality. The case has been revisited many times in documentaries, books, and crime discussions. Each time, new generations of Australians are reminded of the darkness that unfolded in their own backyard. The Truro murders became a landmark case in the country's criminal history, not only for the scale of the crimes, but also for the way they exposed the vulnerability of young women and the manipulative power of predators. When we think of true crime, we often imagine distant, foreign cases, stories from faraway countries. But for Australians in the late 1970s, this horror unfolded just outside their city. It was local, it was real, and it proved that evil can exist anywhere, even in small towns surrounded by open fields and clear skies. The legacy of the Truro murders also influenced law enforcement in South Australia. Police procedures for handling missing persons began to change. Before these crimes, reports of young women disappearing were often dismissed, especially if they were believed to be runaways or involved in hitchhiking. After the case, authorities began treating disappearances with greater urgency. The lesson was harsh, but clear hesitation could cost lives. The failures of the past forced a shift in policing culture, ensuring that victims would be taken seriously from the very beginning. For many families, that change was the only small piece of justice that came out of such unimaginable tragedy. The story of Worrell and Miller also leaves us with disturbing psychological questions. Why did Miller follow Worrell so blindly? Was it fear, dependence, or some twisted loyalty? Could he have stopped the murders if he had spoken up earlier? And what about Worrell? How could someone so outwardly charming harbor such cruelty? These are the questions that keep criminologists and psychologists returning to the case, searching for answers that may never come. Even decades later, the images of shallow graves in the South Australian countryside remain, etched into public memory. They stand as a chilling reminder that behind every missing person's name is a family, a story, and sometimes a crime far worse than anyone could imagine. The Truro murders were not just about the victims who were found. They were also about the hidden victims, the families destroyed, and the trust in community safety that was ripped apart. No movie could ever fully capture the horror of the Truro murders, because this was not scripted, this was not acted, it was real, and that reality is what makes it unforgettable.